You can't fake a lot of this stuff. Customers will know when you're asking peremptory questions, right? When you're asking questions that should be asked, that they expect you to ask. And I want to talk about the Lyme book in a second, about how that's changed me as a sales professional. But, they know when you're asking them the basic question: what keeps you up at night, right? What are some of the challenges? What are the biggest pains? Even things like, how have you changed because of the pandemic? I mean, these are things that great sales professionals know ahead of time. So they're listening for you to answer, but they're asking you the right questions so that you're going to give them the right answers.
Hello and welcome to Marketing Speak. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It's my pleasure to have Fred Diamond with us. Fred is co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales, or IES. He's also authored the book Insights for Sales Game Changers, and he hosts the award-winning Sales Game Changers podcast, which features global sales leaders from companies such as Salesforce, IBM, Hilton, Oracle, and Nestle. He's also, by the way, the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, What Family Members, Partners, and Friends Who Love a Chronic Lyme Survivor Need to Know. Completely separate from the world of sales and marketing, but coincidentally released on the same day as his other book, Insights for Sales Game Changers. And by the way, Fred was a guest on my other podcast talking about Lyme disease on Get Yourself Optimized. Fred, it's so great to have you on the show.
It's good to see you again, my friend.
So we know each other from JVMM, which is Dove Gordon's mastermind. JVMM stands for Joint Venture Mastermind. And I loved having you on as a guest on my other show on Get Yourself Optimized. We talked about Lyme disease on that show. And your book that we discussed, Love, Hope, Lyme, is all about how to assist a chronic Lyme survivor as a family member or a caregiver. And we have also this other book, Insights for Sales Game Changers, but you've strangely released both of them on the exact same day. So why? what was the strategy behind that?
So I run the Institute for Excellence in Sales. We're a global organization where we help employers attract, retain, motivate, and elevate top-tier sales talent. So we typically work with large organizations with large sales teams, companies like Salesforce, Amazon Web Services, et cetera. And over the years, we launched our podcast, the Sales Game Changers podcast. People were looking at us for, among other things, thought leadership, advice on how to become more effective as an enterprise sales organization. So right before the pandemic, we had planned, since we had done at that point a couple hundred episodes of our Sales Game Changers podcast. And by the way, tip for your audience, we began transcribing them from day one, right? So every single show we did from day one, we transcribed. I knew we would use it at some point. So literally right before the pandemic, I met with a content expert, and we put out a plan where we were going to create some ebooks and some memes and all these things. Of course, the pandemic kicked in, so things got delayed. And then about a year into the pandemic, I said, let's get this book done. Let's turn it into a book. So I reached back out to the content expert I was referring to. And the advice that we got on that particular book was to create a 15-chapter book with 15 quotes in each chapter, right? And since I had interviewed somebody on all my podcasts, we just had a wealth of content. Along the way in my personal life, and again, thank you for having me on your other podcast, someone that I had in my life has what's known as chronic Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a tick-borne illness. It's at the epidemic stages in the United States and other places around the globe. When this particular person had a major flare related to her disease, I decided to become an expert on Lyme disease and what it was and what family members, partners, and friends need to know. So Steph and I, these two concurrent things happening in my life. One is running the business, growing the Institute for Excellence in Sales for companies like I mentioned, Salesforce, Red Hat Software, Oracle, et cetera. And I was trying to understand this particular disease. So I had all this energy to write two books. And next thing I know, I said, you know what? I have them both done. I really, really wanted to get the Lyme book out there into the marketplace. In a lot of cases, it takes people I've spoken to have said it took them 10 years to write a book. This book took me 6 months to write. I dove in deep and like I said, concurrently, we had all the content for the sales book. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to post them on the same day. And there's some pros and cons to both.
Yeah. So what were some of those pros and cons?
Well, the pros are I published 2 books in one day. I like to say I'm the first person in the history of the planet to post a book on sales performance improvement and Lyme disease awareness literally on the same day. So I can advertise. I'm a 2-time author. I say it every chance I get. It's on my LinkedIn, it's on my Facebook, etc. I was able to leverage a lot. I had 2 different teams working with me on both books. The sales book flew. I mean, it was a topic that we knew. We had a lot of the content. I hired somebody to assist me in formulating the book. When I went to a publisher, I self-published both books. So as you know, there's a whole bunch of different ways to publish books. You could find a publisher, you could get a hybrid type of approach, or you could publish yourself on Amazon and other places like that. I hired a company who helps you self-publish. So they basically had both teams. They did 3 things for me. They copy edited the book, although by the time I got it to them, it was pretty good. They created all the graphics for the covers and the back. And third, they teed up the book and all the files that you need to post a book up on Amazon and the other places where you want to go. So it was helpful to get them both going at the same time. They're both done too. So both books are done. It's allowed me to communicate the sales book to the community I want to communicate it to. And it's also allowed me to communicate the Lyme book to the community that I want to communicate to. On the con side, I've given a lot more attention to the Lyme book. Now, if I had just written a sales book, like a lot of the people that we know in JVMM and in our communities, they mostly publish books for their business, right? How to be a better leader, how to be a better marketer, how to be an intuitive decision maker, whatever their angle might be. And you could do a lot around that to get speaking gigs and consulting gigs, et cetera. I really believe, although I'm very excited and happy about the sales book, Insights for Sales Game Changers. And I mean, I've had people who've reached out, said that they read it every time they go to a conference. And, I've had a whole slew of people who knew about it, who've reached out, and we've given it to our customers. We've signed copies for our customers. We've had book signings at their offices, which have been very cool. But to be honest with you, I've given a lot more attention to getting the Lyme book out in the marketplace because I've seen the impact that it's had on people who suffer from Lyme and people in the community. As a matter of fact, someone even referred to me the other day as one of the most important people in the Lyme community. You and I are doing this interview in June of 2023. In August of 2022, nobody knew me in the Lyme community. I had one person in my life that I was committed to. Now I have a couple thousand Facebook friends. I get 5 to 8 people reach out to me every day. I've traveled across the country to do book signings. I've given free copies to people with Lyme disease. I have so many new friends that are bona fide, legitimate friends. And one of the top leaders in the Lyme community just wrote another book, and she asked me to write the foreword to her book. So it's opened up this whole new world. Would I do it again on the same day? Yeah, probably. I would. I mean, the sales book is helping as a marketing tool, but I know the Lyme book is making more of an impact.
Yeah. So what are some examples of some of the game-changing insights that you give sales leaders in the book?
So the way we went about this book was interesting. The time we had written it, we had done about 450 Sales Game Changers podcast interviews. So I had quotes from great sales leaders. You mentioned them in the beginning, companies like Nestle and Hilton and Amazon and all these great companies, Microsoft. Most of my world is in the business to business or enterprise sales world. So my customers are companies, like I said, Microsoft, Oracle, LinkedIn, Red Hat software, HPE software. So on our podcast, we typically interview those types of leaders. So we had just great content. We sat down, and the way we went about writing the book was we came up with the 30 most commonly uttered words on the Sales Game Changers podcast. And I don't mean words like the or is. I mean words like empathy, prospecting, leadership, teamwork, listening, etc. We had someone on our team go and research where those words were used in various quotes, throughout the 400 and some odd episodes. Now we're over 650 episodes of the podcast, but at the time we're up to 450. And we looked at all these amazing quotes, and some words had hundreds, like prospecting and empathy had like hundreds of great quotes. And again, a lot of our podcasts were done during the pandemic. So empathy, of course, you can imagine, was such a huge word. And some words surprisingly only had, a couple dozen. So we narrowed it down to 15 words, and we went through them a whole bunch of times and found the best ones. And we put it together into various chapters. Let's start with empathy. So it was a couple of examples of empathy. Sales professionals, and I want to kind of categorize sales professionals at two levels. People who are, let's say, 15 years into their career, and they've established themselves. They know that they're a sales professional. They've worked for great companies. They've had great performance. They've learned the skills. They've learned a marketplace. They've learned the process to communicate value to the marketplace. And then I also want to talk about people who are new in the sales profession. And I'm going to say 50% of those people will continue. Sales is probably the hardest profession in your company, I believe, if you're a B2B company or small company for that matter. So it's a profession. We like to say that sales, if you're a professional, you should be doing things that professionals do. So when we wrote the book, we thought of those two audiences, people who are deep into their career, who are looking to keep going and increment their performance, and people who have some skills and some talent who foresee this as being their career, as compared to non-sales professionals who want to learn about sales. Although we've had a whole bunch of people who aren't quote unquote sales professionals, who are business owners, solopreneurs who've bought the book and read the book and have found a lot of value in it.
Mm-hmm. So what would be an example for something that a business owner might glean from the book that could change the way that they prospect, sell, close deals, retain clients?
Let's see. Let's talk about listening. So we have a chapter called Listening and Questioning, Practical and Powerful Tips and Strategies. And it was funny, before the pandemic, I would physically go to sales leaders' offices. And that was one of the ways that I grew my business. Sales VPs were my customers. So I would try to get appointments with sales leaders. I would go to their office. I would bring my podcast kit, my mics, my filters, my recording kit, and I had a process, and I gave them the questions ahead of time. When I would ask them for their superpower or tell us a skill that you're most exceptional at, frequently the answer would come up listening, right? So people would say things like, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that order, or the 66% solution. And I would take that for granted. I would say, Stephan, okay, great, listening. Well, tell us another skill. And then I realized that listening came up as a skill with some of the top sales leaders at great companies, at Oracle and formerly at like Sun Microsystems and LinkedIn and IBM. And I said, let's get deeper. So I started asking people, well, tell us, how are you such a great listener? What makes you a great listener? And people would say things like they would prepare. And a lot of people don't do this. They don't prepare for the interview. And a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about here might sound intuitive, but they're things that people just don't do. Or a lot of people prepare for the sales call on their way to the sales call. Or if it's a Zoom-ish type of sales call, maybe they'll prepare for 3 minutes before the appointment. Right. And you can get away with that in some cases by doing quick Google searches and things like that. But the true elite sales professionals, they've been preparing for weeks in some cases. They've been finding things that will help them ask the right questions, but they already know some of the answers because they've prepared a lot. Second thing is they realize that if the customer is doing most of the talking, then it's a successful sales call, because customers want to talk about themselves, and customers want to talk about their challenges. And customers also want to discover their solutions on their own. Now, they'll see value in you if you're helping them get there. But I've heard some studies where customers get more value out of things that they deduce on their own versus what you tell them. So at the same time, though, they might be looking for expert advice. The other thing, too, is there's a quote that came up. We heard this during the beginning of the pandemic that we talk about in the book. It's wait, WAIT. Why am I talking? And some of the great sales professionals would say they realized along the way that, especially now where customers can get information on the internet, they're not necessarily looking for the sales professional to be a walking brochure, right? Up until maybe 15, 20 years ago, Stephan, the sales professional was a brochure. You had to talk about your company's direction, the industry, et cetera. Now the customer can research that on their own before they even engage with you. One last thing as it relates to listening is all of the great sales professionals and sales leaders that we've interviewed on the podcast and that we've included in the book, Insights for Sales Game Changers, they were curious. They had this natural curiosity and it was genuine. You can't fake a lot of this stuff. Customers will know when you're asking peremptory questions, right? When you're asking questions that should be asked, that they expect you to ask. And I want to talk about the Lyme book in a second about how that's changed me as a sales professional. But, they know when you're asking them the basic question, what keeps you up at night, right? What are some of the challenges? What are the biggest pains? Even things like, how have you changed because of the pandemic? I mean, these are things that great sales professionals know ahead of time. So they're listening for you to answer, but they're asking you the right questions so that you're going to give them the right answers.
That's great stuff.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love it. And that leads me to the next question, which you actually alluded to while you were talking, is what's changed you as a sales professional through that process of writing a book about Lyme disease?
Yeah. So one thing we also talk about in the book is authenticity, vulnerability, authenticity. And that was something that we touched on once in a while in a podcast before the pandemic. And of course, once the pandemic kicked in, everybody in the world was dealing with the effects of the pandemic, either how, the COVID was keeping them inside, how it was changing their life, their family life. If there was some effects medically, there was always effects financially, especially if your industry was turned off for a year, like the entertainment industry, or hospitality was destroyed. Still, it's going to be recovering for the next couple of years. So everybody was challenged, and then everybody was challenged with however else they were challenged. So that was something that we would talk a lot about on the Sales Game Changers podcast. Once the pandemic kicked in, one of the great quotes we had was, everyone's in the same ocean, but fighting different waves or different boat or something along those lines. The pandemic was personal for everybody. When I decided to pursue Lyme disease and why it affected somebody who I cared for, I dove in, and I dove in personally. And then, you and I are both marketers. So, we make use of social media. So I started going up on Facebook and posting things that I discovered. And I started posting things on LinkedIn. I'm a little bit new to Instagram and some of the other social media forums, but definitely Facebook and LinkedIn. And people started to notice. And what started happening was that people would reach out to me, people in the sales world, and they would say, why are you posting about Lyme disease? And I would tell them some of the story about what had happened and why I decided to learn more. And people started telling me their stories. Well, I don't know if you know this, but my niece has Lyme disease. Or these are people telling me this. My niece doesn't have Lyme disease, but my niece has Lyme disease. Or my wife's sister-in-law has Lyme disease. Or one of my coworkers' wives has Lyme disease. So I'll give you an example. I was at an event in early 2023, and I don't talk about this in the book because it happened in 2023, but I've talked about this story before. My customers, again, are sales VPs, people who run sales organizations. I'm on LinkedIn trying to figure out who they are. I'm talking to them all the time. Our organization, the Institute for Excellence in Sales, provide them services. The guy who I was at an event, it was a partner event for a large technology company. And there was a guy that I've been, prospecting to for the last 10 years. I know he has about 100 salespeople. He's not too far from where I am. By the way, I'm in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. And, I expected this to be a flyby type of a wave. And I saw this guy across, across the buffet line, and he waved back to me, and I thought that was it. Okay, good. Nice to know you. So he came up to me with a plate of food and he said, why are you writing so much about Lyme disease. And I was okay. I told him some of the story, and then he said, I don't know if you know this, but my son was bitten 3 years ago. He's in his early 30s and he doesn't work anymore. He can't work. He's so fatigued. He's been to all these doctors. He's tried all these treatments. Now, me as an expert now on Lyme disease, I knew exactly what he was going through. I knew what his son was going through. I knew how much of a challenge it was for him as a parent. So the conversation I had with him was probably one of the most authentic conversations I ever had in my life. And it was about real things that he was dealing with. And I didn't have to say, should I ask him about his pain and what keeps him up at night? I knew the pain he was going through. By this point, I had spoken to hundreds of parents with teenage children or early 20s whose children can't work anymore. They can't have relationships. The pain and the anxiety is through the roof. So I didn't have to look at my list of questions. You know, he asked me things, I knew things, and I knew I asked him how was he being treated. And it was just one probably the most natural conversations I've ever had in my life. And then at the end, about 15 minutes in, he said, well, tell me more about the Institute for Excellence in Sales. You know, give me a little more, give me an update. And I said, okay, well, blah, blah, blah. Here's what we're focusing on. He said, you know, maybe now's the right time, you know, for us to engage. So we scheduled a Zoom call. And then 2 months later, they become a partner. We call our customers partners. So his company became a partner of the Institute. And, you know, as I tell people, 2 years ago, I didn't sit down and as I was drafting my marketing plan and say, okay, I'm going to do some webinars. I'm going to do a podcast. I'm going to write a book about a disease that I know nothing about, you know, no BS like that. I mean, I had the webinars and the podcast and all those things, but, you know, the life event that happened to me led me to be open about this. And it led me to a customer. And I'm sure that that'll lead to more. And it really said for me, and it broke down our relationship in a good way. It broke it into, yeah, he knows I have something to sell. He knows that I want VPs of sales to become customers, and that we have a women in sales program, and that we do an award event every year, and that we have a conference for women in October, and that we have a leadership program. He knows that, you know. But now, you know, we had this relationship on a different level, and it said to me, you got to figure out a way to get to those authentic conversations.
Love that. Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. And what occurs to me when you're talking about this is this was meant to be. This was, you know, written in the stars, this conversation and the impact that you've already had on this client partner, and on his organization, on his life, his son, et cetera, is all, you know, kind of written in the stars. And I learned this concept from a guest I had on my other show on Get Yourself Optimized, who's an Akashic Records reader, a pretty famous one. Her name is Anne Marie Pizarro. And she refers to clients or customers as one's assigned group, which means that these are people that you're destined to work with. It takes a lot of the pressure off. I mean, you still have to get off the couch and go and pound the pavement and return calls and all that to close the deals. But these are people you're destined to work with. So just relax and know that you're being guided to work with these folks and to change their lives and vice versa. It's a really powerful concept. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, it's interesting. I write this in the foreword to the book. You know, it's funny. I was a history major in college. I was the editor of my college newspaper, Emory University in Atlanta. And I always thought I was going to be a writer, you know, some type of writer and a journalist or something like that. And I actually worked for McGraw-Hill Publishing in the first job that I worked at after college. And, you know, I remember I was an editor. I was writing reports on data security and telecommunications, things that I had no idea about. But we sat next to the salespeople, and they had an outbound sales team. And they were all, I think there was men and women, but most of them were men. This was the mid 80s. And they would show up in nice suits and they would drive up in nice cars. And I would listen to their conversations. And I remember the conversations well. I remember a couple of the names of these guys from 1985. And I remember how they would ask, and again, this was way before the internet and everything related to that. And we had a lot of customers. It was a very important division to McGraw-Hill Publishing. And I remember how those conversations were professional. They were respectful. They were authentic for the most part, I guess. I don't know. But I remember thinking like, well, these guys were pretty important. And I made my way to have a conversation with the vice president of that organization. And he very kindly gave me some time. And, I asked questions like, how important is what you're selling to the company? And he said, it's critical. He said, we need to sell, we sold these loose leaf reference books of our reviews of tech products. And companies depended upon these as they were going about buying the various types of technology. And he said, companies like Bell Atlantic and AT&T, he said they would buy hundreds, if not thousands of our books because they needed to make good decisions. And we need to figure out a way to get to them. So I always remember these guys. I then went into marketing for most of my career at companies like Apple and Compaq Computer. But I always respected the role of the top sales professionals. And even though I was a marketing professional, I got an MBA along the way. If it weren't for our top sales professionals at every company I was at, the accountants wouldn't have jobs, the finance professionals wouldn't have jobs, the people on the dock wouldn't have jobs. So I really believe it's the most important position in the company, which is why the mission of the Institute and the reason we do the podcast is to help employers attract, retain, and motivate top-tier sales talent.
Right. So did that feel like it was destined to be, or does it feel more kind of random or haphazard to you?
It's interesting. I think I was destined to write the books. I don't know why it took me to the age of 60 to write both books, but essentially when I created the Institute for Excellence in Sales 10 years ago, someone came up to me and said, when are you going to start publishing? And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, you call your company the Institute for Excellence in Sales, Institutes publish. So we're actually working on number 2 in the Insights series. And I'm also working on the second book in the Lyme series. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. Even though I was always in marketing and I had the fortune to work for Apple, which was probably one of the greatest marketers in history of the world. And I worked at Compaq Computer and I had a pretty large budget. And I worked for some other companies along the way. There's an old saying, it was John Wanamaker, the guy who created the Wanamaker department stores, who said, half my money on marketing is wasted. The problem is I'm not sure which half. So luckily, when I was a marketer at Apple and Compaq, I had multi-million-dollar budgets. So I could spend money on almost everything. And to be honest with you, we track things pretty rigorously. But, when you have a couple $1 million to market, you're a genius, because if anything goes right, then it's going to go right. But I always knew that there was something missing in the marketing process, because if things didn't get sold, then like I said before, we didn't have a company. If customers didn't want to buy what we were making, then there was no reason for us to be in business. And I remember when I was at Apple, I was in a junior marketing role, and I had a long conversation with one of our top sales reps. And she said that she believed that my job was to make her job easier. And I took that to heart. I said, you know what? My job is to make it easier for customers to buy our products and for our salespeople to sell our products. So I said, my mission as a marketer was to make it so easy for our salespeople to sell. And there's a whole bunch of ways that happens. The brand has to be good, right? And the products have to be good. One of the reasons why Apple is where it is today is because they had good products. Yeah, you can talk about Steve Jobs all day long and Wozniak and Scully and all those things. But the reality is the products were really, really good. Most of them. Some of them weren't, but most of them were really, really good. And we had some really, really smart people. But I always believed that even though I was a marketer and I was a history major, that the sales process, the sales activity is where it was. They're the heroes of the company. Someone talked on one of the Sales Game Changers podcasts. We mentioned this in a book, that when the pandemic kicked in, the sales teams were going to lead companies through. And they still are today. Again, we're doing today's interview in June of 2023. There, of course, have been layoffs and there have been some macro-related things. And I'm sure you've covered them in other places. But it's still all about how the sales professionals are leading their companies through a challenging time. And it's always a challenging time.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the concepts in your sales book. We talked about listening, and one one chapter that I really am curious to hear more about is the one on mindset. And let me just give you a quick story before we delve into some of the advice from these sales leaders. I had a call with my friend and past guest on this show, Greg Merrilees, just the other day, and we were talking about mindset. And my son, who's 3, was sitting on the couch with me and playing and doing his thing, and then he starts interrupting and saying, "Greg, Greg, Greg, Greg," and Greg's like, "Yes, what? Tell me, give me a complete sentence." And my son just stares at Greg on Zoom, and who's based in halfway around the world in Melbourne, Australia, and he says, "Mindset is everything." And I could just see Greg's mind was blown. Like, well, this is from the mouths of babes, right? This is like such powerful wisdom. And so I just wanted to share that fun story that happened a couple days ago. He was really impacted by that. And by the way, the episode where I interviewed Greg about converting through a conversion-focused web design for your website, it's a powerful episode. So tell us about mindset.
Yeah, good for you and for your son. He's off to a great start. I look forward to listening to the other show as well. Little story real briefly. So the Institute for Excellence in Sales has been around since about 2013. And one thing that we used to do is prior to the pandemic is we did a lot of live things for your listeners in the Washington, D.C. area. It's built on what we call the Beltway. People in the U.S. have probably heard about inside the Beltway, and inside the Beltway is where the White House and all the museums and D.C., the District of Columbia is. And around the Beltway, there's a whole bunch of different types of industries. Where I am is in Northern Virginia, which is pretty much the business center of the D.C. area. So a lot of the technology companies and a lot of hospitality companies are headquartered there. So we used to do a lot of live events. In 2015, we did a live event featuring some of the top sales speakers in the country at the time. Your audience may or may not know people like Jeb Blunt, who has written a whole bunch of books, Anthony Iarino, Mark Hunter. And we had 6 of these speakers. We had a couple hundred people in the room. And at the very end, I said, all right, guys, it was a full day event. Give us one bit of advice. If you could share one thing with the sales professionals listening or in our office, in our room today, it was a live event. What would that be? 5 out of the 6 said it's all about mindset. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. Mindset. So when the pandemic kicked in, we started doing podcasts every day, and we did them in the form of webinars. So we would do a live webinar and we would convert it to an audio podcast. In the beginning of the pandemic and all through the first 18 months, we would get 200 people every day who would log in, upwards of 50 to 200 to 300 people would log in, and they would watch us have an interview like this or with a panel, whatever it might be. The reason I say that is every day we created a different show. Tuesday was our Women in Sales show. Wednesday, I interviewed sales VPs. Friday was sales tactics. And Thursday, we call Thursday the Optimal Sales Mindset show. And every week we would talk about mindset and how critical mindset was to being a sales professional. And I had high performance athletic coaches, people who've worked with great basketball stars like Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson and Kevin Durant. We had people from the entertainment space who talked about mindset. We had people who talked about, just the general way about thinking and mindset, positivity. They're so critical because you're trying to influence, someone to do something that they may or may not want to do, or they're going to be reticent to do for whatever the reason is. And your job is it's not to convince them to do something they don't want to do, because that's going to eventually get caught. That's not what sales is. Sales is about helping your customer or your prospect. It's about being of service to them to help them solve their challenges, right? So we talk a lot about how to put yourself in that framework, in that mindset where you are of service and you are of positive service because you are helping someone achieve something that they most importantly need to do. I'm going to give you a fun example that came from one of the podcasts that we included in the book. I had the comedian Tom Dreesen on one of the shows, and Tom Dreesen was one of the top comedians in the 1980s. I think he was on Letterman like 100 times. He might have been the guest host for the Johnny Carson show. I don't remember. He wrote a book, and he talked about how he was a opening act for Frank Sinatra for 14 years. And for the people listening to the show who don't know who Frank Sinatra was, Frank Sinatra was the most successful singer probably in the history of modern contemporary music, if you will. He sang songs like "My Way" and New York's, New York, New York, etc. "Summer Wind," "Strangers in the Night." So I had Tom Dreesen on the show, and he talked about his career, but I said, I want to talk about the mindset of Frank Sinatra and how can we relate that to the sales profession. So he said this is the first time that he was ever asked about Frank Sinatra's mindset, right? So he said three things came to mind. He said the first thing was Frank Sinatra knew everything that was going on. He said Frank Sinatra knew if the third trombone player came in a second late, right? And he said he knew everyone's job and he let them do their jobs. He let them do their jobs, like the PR people and the publicity and the arena people, etc. But he knew what everybody was supposed to do. And he was so perfect in his participation that once again, if the third tuba player or trombone player came in a millisecond late, he would stop the performance and say, why'd you come in a millisecond late, right? Maybe I'm extreme, but you understand what I'm saying. Second thing he said was that Frank Sinatra was always on time. And he said that if he had a 12 o'clock appointment scheduled with you, if it was 12 o'clock in 1 second and you weren't there, he was gone. His time was so important to him, his preparation, his livelihood. If you weren't going to give him the respect that he required to be there on time, then he was gone. And that's so relatable to the sales process. How many times have we seen people get on a Zoom call at 12:02, right? You're sitting there at 12 o'clock, you're a customer or you're a sales professional. The other person's not there or your teammate's not there, or they're fiddling with, can you hear me? That type of thing, or those kinds of things. And 12 o'clock, he was gone. The third thing he said, which really kind of was interesting as well. He said he went with Frank Sinatra to a Italian restaurant in New York City or New Jersey, I guess. Frank was, of course, from Hoboken. And he said the guy had a sign, Frank Sinatra's favorite Italian restaurant. And Dreesen said he saw that sign in 100 different Italian restaurants. And he said to Frank, he said, doesn't it bother you that 100 guys say that their restaurant is your favorite Italian restaurant? And Sinatra said to him, if it's going to help the guy sell 100 pieces of cannoli, he can say it's my favorite place. It really doesn't bother me. And it was such a generous, spirit, and he understood his role, right? And there's a lot about Frank Sinatra. There's plenty of books, good and bad, that have been written. But, those three things he said just made Sinatra the top performer. And we talked about that on our Optimal Sales podcast. And there's so much lessons, and I include that in the book. There's so many lessons that come from those three things.
That's awesome. Are you a fan of Frank Sinatra?
I'm from Philadelphia, and a lot of Italian people are from Philly, and Sinatra was huge. I don't know if you know this or not, but I was a DJ on weekends after I got out of college. When I was working at McGraw-Hill, on weekends, I would work as a wedding, bar mitzvah, graduation party DJ. And I probably played New York, New York, every single party I did. I probably, even like 13-year-old birthday parties, I probably did My Way, if not every other party. A lot of times on Friday at 5, I'll throw on my Sinatra playlist. That's usually the only time during the week that I listen to him. It's interesting. A guy like Sinatra has touched so many people millions, if not tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions. As a sales professional, if you're touching people, if you're helping them achieve their goals, I've had people who've been on the show, on the Sales Game Changers podcast, who talk about how their customers have maintained 30-year friendships. I've interviewed some people. Tamara Greenspan is in the show. She's a sales leader at Oracle for 30 years. And we talked about how her personal relationships have continued over 30 years. One thing that people don't always realize is customers who have jobs that would be serviced by B2B sales professionals, such as high-tech related jobs, software, services related to software, customers don't want to leave their jobs. Customers want to stay. They're not looking to jump for the most part, right? They're very risk adverse, especially if they're in IT or finance or accounting. They want to hold on to a good job as long as they can, right? So if you're a really good elite sales professional, you may have relationships that are going to go going for 15, 20, 30 years, especially if you're selling to like the government or large companies that have been around for a long time. People don't want to leave. Maybe they'll eventually retire, but they don't want to jump around. They want to hold on to the jobs they have. So you, as a sales professional, if you have the mindset of helping them achieve their goals, you can have a very successful and lucrative career, presuming you're selling the right stuff at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to have a quality product or service for sure.
And you want to sell a lot too. I mean, I live in the DC area, and, people ask me a lot of times, Stephan, is like, how do I become successful? And I say, sell something that's in demand that a lot of people want to buy. The guy who sells Dell computers to the Navy, he's living in a really nice house, right? The guy who sells, screws to General Motors, he's living in a very nice house in the suburb of Detroit. So you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to be the guy who sells Dell computers to the Navy. It's going to take you 20, 25 years to get there, right? But if you're good at this profession, this glorious profession of sales, and you're a sales game changer, you'll get there if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And if everything goes right.
Yeah. Now, one thing that you touched on earlier that was important for a successful sales professional is the preparation. And I know you have a chapter on preparation in your book. So what are some practical things that are kind of universal among top sales professionals in terms of their preparation? What are they doing?
So let's go back to the example I just used before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's go back to the example I used before. When people ask me how they can have a successful sales career, one of the first things I'll say is be the expert in your industry, right? So the guy who I referred to before who sells Dell computers to the Navy, he got to that place because he is an expert in two things. He's an expert in the business of the Navy, and he's also, of course, an expert in the technology that Dell can provide and the ecosystem related to that as well. But let's go back to the first thing. If you're someone who's buying a lot of computers, let's say, for the Navy or for any government agency or B2B enterprise, you want to ensure that the people who you're working with, they know your challenges. And the only people they're going to be talking to, right, are the people who can help them achieve their goals if you're in the vendor community. We've done this a couple of times on the show. If you want to get to talk to, let's say, a CEO or a COO, there's about 100 people ahead of you, right? There's their direct reports, there's their peers, there's the people above them, there's their top customers. Then they're going to get to the vendors who are helping them achieve their goals. Then there's other advisors along the way. Then there's other partners. So you need to be able to be in that particular place. If you're a 22-year-old aggressive sales professional, you ain't going to get the audience of the CEO. But if you aspire to be the guy who sells Dell to the Navy, then you are understanding the marketplace. You're reading all the time. You're getting all the newsletters, and you're reading the newsletters for your industry. You're building a network of other professionals who are selling things either to Dell or from like companies like Dell, for example, to the Navy. You're very aware of who the network is that you need to build with the other providers who service that particular marketplace. But the number one thing is you got to be an expert. You want to be the guy who is, or lady who is the expert in the Navy. And oh, by the way, right now you're selling Dell computers, right? Or you're providing Dell services, or you're providing Oracle, whatever it might be, or you're providing hospitality solutions. But when you're talking, when you get the remote opportunity to engage in a real conversation, they don't want to be talking about the Yankees, maybe for a minute if you're a fan or something. They want to be talking about, I got these big challenges. How are you going to help me? And you got to get in there right away. That's why I said before, listening is about knowing the answers to the questions that you're going to be asking, right? The questions, they always say you should know the answer to every question that you ever ask. But, it's being prepared. It's talking to people all through the organization. One of the challenges that I see that always just, this blows my mind, are sales professionals who haven't built an extended network at their target. They're relying on one person. I've been in meetings where sales professionals said, oh yeah, we're definitely going to get the deal. We had a great first meeting. Every first meeting is great. The customer is learning something new. They're going to get some data points, some pebbles from you. So the customer is almost always going to be happy, right? Customers are always looking in many cases for, things to be aware of because they're trying to be experts inside their company. So if you're offering a tech or a service, technology or a service, they're probably going to have a meeting with you if it's on their radar screen, and it's going to go well. But the challenge is the second meeting, and the challenge is, providing significant value. So I always say, if you want to be successful in sales, be an expert in that marketplace so that when you get that opportunity, you're demonstrating to the customer that you understand their market. You're not just there to shill. And you could do that on LinkedIn. You could do that on YouTube. You could do that on Twitter, Instagram. One blog article can go a long way. LinkedIn. Use LinkedIn to show, don't just shill for your company, but post things that are of value that show that you're an expert in the marketplace. Go to conferences, take pictures with other senior leaders, and those things trigger. But to get to that point, you got to study. That's why we use the word before, professional. If you're a professional, what else you do? What do you do? What do professionals do? A golf professional is on the putting green for 4 hours a day, right? A golf professional is at the driving range every day for at least an hour or whatever. And he or she is also working on the mental side. That's what professionals do. They don't wing it. They don't get on a call at 1 minute before. They don't, or 1 minute afterwards. All those things are refined. And you know what? I've worked with so many elite sales professionals, and we've interviewed them for the book. They do those things. They don't wing it. They don't show up unprepared. They respect what the customer is going through. And one way to show respect is to understand what their challenges are and prepare for those meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that comes through loud and clear is part of being prepared is to be on time and have everything lined up so that you're not scrambling and flustered or even seconds late. Because if they're on the call on Zoom waiting for you, even though you were there at, let's say it was a 12 o'clock meeting and it's 12 o'clock, you weren't there at 11:59:59. They were. And that's not a great way to start. So whatever you needed to do to prepare to make sure that you were there on time, end the previous meeting 5 minutes early, not have back-to-back calls, set up your Zoom so that you don't have a waiting room, but there's direct access to your Zoom through just putting the password in the URL. That sort of stuff makes you look, like you say, like a professional.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the Sinatra example. I remember that interview very, very clearly. And, he said if it's 12 o'clock in 1 second, Frank was gone. He said, he left. He was there at 5 minutes till or whatever. And he said 12 o'clock in 1 second, he was gone. Sometimes there's going to be, a monkey wrench is going to get thrown in. I had a sales call planned with somebody about a month ago. And the day before, she said, I look forward to talking to you tomorrow at noon. And, I logged in at 1 minute till. I like to log in into Zoom calls at least 2 minutes ahead of time So it's probably 11:58, and she wasn't on. And I got an email from her at 12:02. Fred, I'm sorry, but my husband died this morning. Can we reschedule? I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm here. No, I was like, of course, your husband died. Why are you even at 12:02 telling me that your husband died? But yeah, every once in a while there's a monkey wrench. But professional. If we could do one message here for your audience, Stephan, if you're a professional, you got to be thinking about your professionals. Those sales leaders who have been who are 15 years into their career, they're professionals. If you're not a professional, you're going to be flushed out. Sales is the only performance related job at your company. You only eat when you get paid, type of a thing. So you get flushed out. It's very hard for an accounting major to get flushed out of an accounting job. It's very hard for a finance major, even in product design. They'll give you some time to figure out and learn things. Sales professionals, you need to hit the ground running, even if it's your first job. And you got to hustle, and you got to think, and you got to research. You got to learn what are the right questions to be asking. One last thing that we didn't talk about is I had a chapter on mentorship and coaching, and the great sales leaders talked about how open they were to coaching. I want to say the distinction between mentoring and coaching. Mentoring is seeking out somebody for some advice that you may or may not use. Coaching is when you say, I want to get better, you hire a coach and you do what they tell you to do. You just don't take, yeah, sure, I'll think about exercising in the morning. You do it. A professional athlete does what his coach or her coach tells them to do, even if they don't like it. So that's one that comes up frequently as well.
That's awesome advice. Thank you so much, Fred. And if our listener or viewer wants to work with the Institute, wants to learn from you, read your book, listen to your podcast, where should we send them?
Yeah, I mean, the books are on Amazon. Reach out to me via LinkedIn or Facebook. I'm always up on LinkedIn. I post every day. I'm always up on Facebook. It's very easy to find me. There aren't too many Fred Diamonds in that case. Again, both books are available on Amazon. If you're a sales leader and you lead an organization and you would like to consider being on the podcast, like I said, reach out to me via LinkedIn. I'm very ubiquitous on LinkedIn, so I'd love to connect with you there. And thank you again. I just want to acknowledge you. You're doing a lot of great things. Again, we met through JVMM. We've obviously you gave me the honor of being a guest on your other podcast. It's mind blowing to me that I can talk for 2 hours about Lyme disease, but I've done close to 30 podcasts where I was a guest on Lyme disease. So thank you for giving me that opportunity, and just want to acknowledge you for the great work that you're doing for your clients. I know you've helped a lot of people in the JVMM community, and I just want to acknowledge you for the good work you do.
Oh, thank you, Fred. And thank you for what you do in the world. Like you're out there revealing light, which is amazing, and it's beautiful and far-reaching. Your ripple effect is much greater than you can possibly imagine.
Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Well, listener, go out there and create your ripple effect. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.